Hello guys, welcome to this discourse as regards to a React hook known as UseReducer. But before I begin, I'd like to talk about how state is managed in React. Now what I have here is a simple React app. It's just a counter. And I have two buttons here, increment and decrement. So what I do is, if at all I press increment, I increment the count by 1. And decrement, I do the opposite. I decrement the count by 1. That's understandable, right? Inside here, I have two buttons. Then I have on-click event listeners. Then for these two, I have defined their functions here. And then what I just do is just take this count variable, just increment it by 1 using this setter function. For those who don't know, we have a hook known as useState, which is used to store our state variables. And then if we destructure that, we get two things from that. The first one is a variable, which can be anything, and then the second one is just a function. And what this function does is it is used to set the count or update the state. And that's pretty much everything about how state works in React. Now, whatever I'm doing here, I'm using this setter function here to directly update state. But then imagine if you add complex state. Let's assume you had a form. Then you'd need to have something like, let's say, another state variable called form data. Then you need to have, let's say, set form data, and then do use state, and then set it to an empty object. Let's say inside your form you have the name, and then you have something like password, then search. Then let's say beside that you had something like users. Let's say you are calling an API or hitting up an API. Then it gave you users. You'd need to have another state variable here. Let's say users, and then you need to do set users. Then what you can see from the examples I'm showing you here is that you'll end up having something we call complex state, meaning you have a lot of state variables, and that would make your code actually cluttered and hard to understand and debug. But then let's assume that you had a different way of managing state, and specifically now complex state. And that's where the UseReducer hook comes into play. It is used when we have complex state. And what it does, it actually reduces our state into an object. And inside that object, we have key value pairs. And our keys are our state variables. And that's just it. And our values are the values of the state. I know that doesn't make sense for some of you. But then to make it sync, let me show you an example. Before I even use the hook, because what I see most people do, they immediately go into using the hook, and that's where I think they get a lot of people messed up. First of all, let's assume we have an object. I hope you're following with me. Let's say you have an object, let's call it initial state. Inside this object, we can define our count variable, and then just initialize that to 0, okay? Now from here, instead of having this count variable exist as a singleton down here, what we can do is we can include this object which contains our count inside here. So here we can say, we can call it state, and then here just say set state. Then inside here we can just initialize this state with our object and say initial state. And then we can just comment this out, Control B, and then this one too, Control B. Now, imagine also that you had a function called reducer, which is used to update the state. And then we can define that function here. Let's call it reducer. Now, What this function will do is that it will take in our state. And then we want this function to actually update our state and relieve our setter function here from doing that. What we do with say set state, and then because our state is an object, we do object, and then we spread in the previous state, and then just update the variable that we are seeking for, and that's count. Let's say we want to increment that by 1, we do state.count, and then we add 1, and that will be it. But then we need to call this function down here. Let's say in our handle increment. Here we'd say reducer, then just pass in our state. Now, if I refresh this, I'm sorry, down here I'm also supposed to change this count variable, that's why we have an error. I'd say, instead of count, I just say state.count. Then now that should work. Now, if I press increment, you see I'm incrementing our state by 1. And by our state I mean our count variable. Now this is what I've done. I took out our state variable and just defined it inside an object which I called initial state, and then took that object and then used it as our initial state. Then from there I defined a function which is supposed to update our state instead of just having the set state setter updating our function or our state, sorry. I hope that makes sense. If at all I wanted to do that for decrement, I just do the same. I just come here, and then copy this, and then just paste it down here. But then we have a problem, because right here, whatever we are doing, we're only incrementing the state by 1. We cannot do something like or, let's say set state, and then we just say decrement that by 1. No. This is where an important aspect of something called an action comes into play. Let's assume into our reducer function, we could pass in an object called action. And inside this object, we could define the type of action that we wanted to take out on our state or just apply to our state. Then we just say type here. Let's say for our first case, it would be increment. Okay, and inside here, instead of just updating the state directly, I'll have to conditionally do that. I'll have to check if our action, the type equals to, let's say, increment, and then if at all our action type is increment, I just set the state, just do what I'd done initially. And then just add 1. And this would still work. What I've just done is that because I wanted to take out 2 actions at once, I have just included a different object called action. And then inside this object we have a type, and this type defines the type of action that we want to take out on our state. And for our first case, it's incrementing the state. If we only wanted to decrement, we do something like this. We'll actually also pass a type here and just say decrement, like so. And here we'd actually need to define another if statement. So we do Control Alt down arrow to copy that down. And here we'd actually need to change a couple of things. The first one being this one. We'd actually need this to be decrement. And then here we'd actually need to subtract this instead of adding that. And once we do that, it also works. Now, whatever I've done here, I've just given you the bare bones on how the UseReducer hook would function or how it functions. Something else, if at all I wanted to increment this count, let's say by 2 instead of 1, I'd also need to pass in another key here. Let's call it payload. That's just convention. You can call this whatever you want. Let's make this a number and say we want to increment our count by 2. What I need to do here, instead of doing state.count plus 1, I'll just add the action dot payload, and that would still work. But now it works, but then we are incrementing the count by 2. Let me refresh this. So if we start from 0, we go to 2, 4, 6, 8. And that right there is the logic behind the UseReducer hook in React. Now let's now get to implementing it. First of all, I need to import it here. And then let's get rid of some things here. Let's get rid of our reducer function. And then let's get rid of this also. And this one also. And save this. Now, this is how we define the UseReducer. And it actually looks quite similar to how we do our use state. Now I'll leave this down here so that we can make reference. So first I'll do state, then we have something called dispatch. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then you do UseReducer. And then this UseReducer hook takes in 2 arguments. The first one being our reducer function, just like the one I defined before, and then our initial state. Now don't be scared. What this one does is it takes our state and then just initializes that with our initial state. If at all I hover over this, you see it's of type const initial state, and then it has a number. Then if I do the same here, I think the way that we could do to see this properly is if we logged them out. Let's log out state to make it simple, and let's get rid of this so that we get rid of the error. If I save this and then define an empty reducer function here so that we can get rid of the errors too. Then save that and then open our developer tools. And then look at this, we have an object. Notice I'm just logging out our state, and this object has a key of count which is initialized to 0. You can see this object is actually similar to our initial state. So whatever is happening here, this state is actually being initialized by or using our initial state, and that's just that simple. Now, remember how we defined our reducer? It will still remain the same. We'd have our state here, and then have our action. And then inside here, we'd have our if statement. Let me just do the increment to go a little bit quicker. Let's say if our action dot type equals to increment, then based on that, we'd return a state, and then just to count, and then do state.count, state.count, and then just add that by 1. Now, coming to this dispatch, what this dispatch function does is it actually takes care of passing in this action object. It's actually quite simple. What we do here is we just come to our handle increment function and just say dispatch. And then inside this function, we'll have our action object, what we initially had, and here we'd say type, there we'd say just increment. And then if we save this and then come back to our counter, it will still work. Whatever this dispatch function does again is it only passes in our action object. If at all I wanted to increment this by 2, I do what we did before, just taking the payload, if I could spell payload, and just make it 2. Then instead of doing +1 here, I'd say state action, action dot payload, and then it would still work. Notice this goes to 10, 14, 18, and so on. If I also wanted to decrement this, I'd actually need to do Control Alt down arrow and then just change this to decrement and do the same. But then you'd notice I'm repeating myself, and that's where, and I won't be abiding by the try principle. Now that's where the switch statement comes into play. Here we can just say action dot type, and that would be our test variable. Then have cases. Our first case would be, let's say, increment. Let me just do increment. And then if at all our action.type is increment, this is what we do. Sorry, I usually do this, I don't know why. We'd actually do this. We'd return our state spread in our previous state, and then just to count, and then count, then state.count, sorry. If I could type state would count +1, then we'd get rid of this. And then this would still work, as you can see. But then we also need to have a default if at all none of our actions are met. And that would be would return our state as it is without manipulating that. And this is actually how the UseReducer hook works. Now to do the decrement, we just come down here and do a dispatch and just say our type will be decrement. Then just come here and define a different case. Decrement. Just return. It's actually the same thing here. I need to change a couple of things. Just say copy this down and paste it here, and then just say subtract 1, and this would work. And that's how the UseReducer hook works. Now, some people would want to define this elsewhere, the whole of this, just outside of this application, just to have separation of constants and to have much more cleaner code. I won't do that here because I'll be confusing you. I just wanted you to see how it all works in one space. Now something else, if at all you had, let's say, a form, you'd actually need to define that state variable here. Say you have name, then you have, let's say, age, then you have something like password, you know what I mean. And I actually have a tutorial on forms and UseReducer coming up, and I'll talk about how you can have controlled inputs and all that. Then I'll also talk about how we can have the separation of constants, in that I'll just define all this in a separate file and just import them up here. This is actually also the inspiration behind Redux and Redux Toolkit. If at all you've done state management tools, they all actually work the same. Since I found out about UseReducer, I've actually barely used it. Maybe because my application are always having complex state. But then yeah, it's a time saver and it's actually quite intuitive once you get used to it. That's it, guys. If at all you guys have questions or would want to know more about something, just leave your comments down below. I'll be sure to reply to your comments. And if you're new, subscribe, like, and leave on the notification.